Hello, everyone. Okay, I think my mic's a little hot here. Turn that down. All right. Happy Monday. Okay, everything seems to be working. Just had a drink of water. I got some water stuck in the back of my throat. 1 second, I'm gonna cough. Excuse me. All right, there we go. Okay, happy Monday. Well, let me dive in here with sort of the normal flow. So, hello and welcome. These are a series of lessons intended to go from someone who has never flown before all the way through getting your private pilot's license. So, these are the rough lesson plans that you would follow with a CFI if you were working towards getting your initial pilot's license. Couple of announcements today that are a little bit bigger news, I would say. So, as you may have picked up from some of the past streams I've mentioned odds and ends of this, but I've been interviewing for a CFI position, and the interviews went well, which is great. And so, assuming nothing unexpected comes up, I'll be starting full time as a CFI at a local flight school in the next week or so. I've been going back and forth about what to do with the flying lessons, given the new schedule and the different hours and a bunch of shifts. And I think because this pre-solo knowledge test and review is a great break point, a great pause point in these lessons, I'm going to have today be our last lesson in this series. So a little bit of a bummer because I've really enjoyed doing these and really enjoyed hanging out with you all, but also really exciting to be jumping into this next stage of my career. The way a lot of syllabi are broken up is the pre-solo portion, the pre-solo cross-country portion, and then sort of the prepping for the check ride. So, and it's usually about 50% or so goes in the pre-solo, 40% in the pre-cross-country, pre-solo cross-country, and about 10% in the final prep. So we're about 50% or so of the way through the syllabus. After I get settled into my new job sometime in the coming months, if there's time available or if it just works out well, then I'd love to resume these. Like I said, I've had a lot of fun, but I think the best thing to do in the near term is to have this one be the last lesson until I get settled in. I will keep the Discord updated if and when the lessons pick back up. Actually, I can post that right now in the chat. Here is the Discord. One other thing to mention, if you are someone who joins for the Tuesday evening social flights, these are every Tuesday, 7 p.m. Pacific time. We just go fly to different parts of the world and kind of explore for about an hour. Those will continue as usual, at least in the foreseeable future. And you can check the Microsoft Flight Sim forums or the Discord for information about those. Okay, so that's sort of the big initial announcement. The rest of the intro script is pretty similar. If you're interested in getting your pilot's license in the real world, the best thing to do, and really the only way to do it, is to find a CFI that you like working with and start to practice with them. So either a CFI at a local airport or a flight school or a flying club, and they'll be able to get you set up with a demo flight. And a demo flight is just a chance to get up in the airplane, try out the controls, and see what you think. I mentioned in the past lessons that lessons build on one another. And so, of course, this is now our lesson 16. So there's quite a bit of stuff we've covered that we'll sort of reference back to. But I also have structured these so that if you're just dropping in for a random live stream, they're still valuable, and hopefully you can pick up some useful information for either your sim flying or your real world flying if you're a pilot. Today's lesson is a little unusual in that it's going to be all about the pre-solo preparation. In the real lesson, we'll talk more about, like, if it was with a student, there's a lot of kind of filling out paperwork, dotting the I's, crossing the T's sort of things. We'll use that time where it would be more paperworky to instead talk about some topics that are good to know pre-solo, but that aren't currently in the lessons we've already covered. So there'll be a kind of a potpourri section at the end of just bonus content. We'll talk about that in a little bit. If you do want to watch any of those older lessons, they are up on YouTube. I'll post that link here. And I'll also mention, while I've got this, typing in the stream chat, is the add-ons. So I'm using a couple of add-ons for these flights. These are all great, highly recommend them, especially the first one, the GNS. GNS 530 replacement. One thing, there was a note in the Discord that the next update that's coming up for Microsoft Flight Sim is going to include improvements to the GNS units, so the 530 and 430. So hopefully in the next release it'll be a better software anyway. If you don't want to get this add-on, it should be greatly improved in that upcoming release. Or if you want to hop on the beta, you could get access to it now. All right, last and not least, if you have any questions or any feedback, definitely post them in the Discord. Even though this is the last live stream for, or last lesson live stream for a while. Um, if you are watching this later and you have any feedback, I'm still always open to it. The way that I structure all my projects, but the way that I structure these is I have a kind of running note including things that would be really nice to improve going forward. And so if someone gives me feedback 3 months from now, I'll drop it in that same note. It won't be lost. And not only won't it be lost, but it'll be appreciated too. So yeah, so Discord is a great place for that feedback if you have any. One bit of follow-up from our last flight, I mentioned there's the ELT in the plane, is this box that'll transmit if it detects an impact. It's sort of a piece of emergency equipment. And I hesitated on what the ELT acronym is. The acronym is Emergency Locator Transmitter. So it was as clunky to say out loud as I thought it was at the time. It sounded wrong coming out, and it still doesn't really flow very well, but it's Emergency Locator Transmitter. So that's what ELT stands for. All right, if there aren't any questions, then we'll dive into today's lessons. Let me flip over here. We've got quite a bit of stuff to run through, and essentially the way today will work is, well, let me run through and talk about the objectives. So the objective is to complete the FAR 6183 student pilot solo requirements, required pre-solo knowledge test, ensure pre-solo documentation is filed, and identify any remaining areas for practice. So this is one of those lessons where with an actual student, this would be all about going back and forth with the student and sort of asking questions on various systems, asking questions about different knowledge areas, and feeling out where the student needs the most additional focused study. And in the lesson schedule, actually, it's in one-on-one session or one-on-one format. It would be an hour on the ground and an hour flight, both intended to sort of feel out where the student would need the most work. So at the end of this lesson, the goal is to have all the paperwork in place to solo, but the goal isn't necessarily to solo just today. So you and me as a CFI and the student would walk away with kind of an understanding of the knowledge gaps and then assign homework based on those specific gaps. Hey, Mr. Calweezy, thanks for joining. So today's lesson for us will be sort of like an hour of ground covering what that pre-solo preparation is and what it looks like. And then instead of an hour of flight, we'll do an hour of sort of additional things that haven't come up in past lessons but are really useful to know. And what I really need to do is pull those into those past lessons. So when I restructured it, it'll show up there. All right. A couple references for today. So there's the West Valley Flying Club solo phase check. So you may have heard this in past ones, but I'm a member of the West Valley Flying Club in the Bay Area. And so a lot of the structures for how especially key phases like this work also have then specific knowledge tests that are part of the club. I pulled a couple of sample questions, just sort of searching around line or just thinking through things that should be asked to a student. So I won't pull up the actual quiz that we use, but there is sort of a process for that sort of thing. And then this lesson is unique in that it builds on all the pre-solo lessons. So the goal, again, is to kind of feel out gaps in knowledge and where to focus attention as we're practicing to actually go out and solo. All right, couple lesson elements we'll talk about. Documentation and paperwork, everyone's favorite. The 6187 student pilot solo requirements, and then 6189 student pilot limitations, and then logging solo flight time. So how do you log solo flight when you're a student pilot? So this is sort of the meat of this. I mentioned that this lesson's a little different and that we'll have this bonus content session. So we'll also talk about regulations, operations, and aircraft. And you can see my to-do of pulling these into the previous lessons so that these things are all kind of scattered between. All right, let's dive in. So documentation and paperwork. So in order to fly solo, you need endorsements from your CFI. I'll walk through what those endorsements are and what they mean, just so that you have sort of a general sense of what you're being endorsed for. But the responsibility is on your CFI to make sure that they're endorsing you correctly for the flying you're going to do. Of course, if you notice something that seems incorrect or a missing endorsement, definitely ask them about it. But as a student, you're not really responsible for knowing specifically what these are as much as for getting them in your logbook and just making sure that they're all lined up. So let's look at what some of these pre-solo endorsements are. So you have your paper or digital logbook, and in there you're going to have a section of endorsements. So like in my digital logbook here, if I go in, I have all these qualifications that have then endorsements. So for instance, when I was doing my solo flight, then I get an endorsement here. This one was actually done as a paper one that I transferred to my electric, but there's my original solo flight endorsement. Or when I was going through, you may get other endorsements throughout your pilot career. So for instance, before I did my commercial pilot aeronautical test, then you get an endorsement saying that you're able to do that, depending on how you do your training. So you'll get a bunch of endorsements in either your digital or your paper logbook. Some of them and sort of what they look like. One is this pre-solo aeronautical test. We're going to talk more about this in just a second. But your CFI will endorse you to say that you've completed a pre-solo knowledge test that complies with this particular FAR for the specific make and model of aircraft that you're flying. You'll then get another endorsement that's your pre-solo flight training. So where this is the knowledge test, this is that flight training. Logged pre-solo training for the maneuvers and procedures that are appropriate to the model and aircraft. So again, we'll look at 6187 in just a moment, and you'll see that list of maneuvers and procedures. You'll also see that those maneuvers and procedures more or less line up with the lessons that we've had the last 15 lessons or so. And that's obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but that is intentional to make sure that as you're getting up to pre-solo, you've kind of picked off of this list of required training. A lot of flight schools will have like a little sticker or another place where your instructor will go back and make sure that they've specifically endorsed you for each of these. It's required to have this sort of pre-solo endorsement, but you also need to have the language of the maneuver written in the comments of the logbook. So when you did go-around training, you should have a note in your logbook in the comments section that specifically says go-arounds. Again, these are all things that are your CFI's problem, not really you at this point in your training. You should know how to log these things because as you're getting into solo flight, then you're going to be doing your own logbook entries. And over the last couple of lessons, that would be more and more on you as a student to be logging yourself. But the endorsements part are not really expected. Like this is what the CFIs kind of expected to do. But the important part to know is that there's this pre-solo knowledge portion and pre-solo flight training. With those both in place, then you'd have this solo flight, and your CFI will endorse you to actually go flying with some number of limitations. These limitations might depend on where you're flying, like the kind of complexity of the airspace or the type of aircraft you're in. Might be things like a maximum crosswind component or minimum cloud requirements or things like that. There's another endorsement depending on where you're flying that allows you to do solo takeoffs and landings at another airport. For folks flying out of Palo Alto, we often will endorse them also to fly to San Carlos and to do takeoffs and landings there for two reasons. One is that, really for one main reason, because as a student pilot practicing solo, you're mostly practicing just the takeoffs and landings, not trying to add complexity. But because San Carlos and Palo Alto are so close, I can show you this on the map. So the flight between these two is a very, it's 7 nautical miles to get up there. And the weather between the two can be pretty, I would say, surprisingly different sometimes. And so if you get caught in a situation where there's too strong a crosswind at San Carlos, you may then come down to Palo Alto and you could land there as a backup. So it's kind of nice to have that endorsement that allows you to then leave that airport and go land at another airport. Otherwise, with that solo endorsement, assuming that you don't have a limitation on it, then you're able to go and fly with it kind of to the practice area, practice, and then come back. So gives you quite a bit of ability to go around. Oh, I do have a to do in here. I need to look up. There's an endorsement of U.S. citizenship, or else that you've completed this sort of um, longer process. It's not really longer. It's just a different registration process. This follows a whole different. You can tell that the number on here is like 1,552. So this follows a whole different set of processes that I need to dig a little bit more into to make sure I got that all buttoned up correctly. But your CFI may take your passport or your other kind of form of ID, and they have to keep a record for 5 years of having worked with you on flight training. So there's a little bit more here. Probably we would do this earlier in the like before pre-solo, but that's one other thing. Okay, so logbook endorsement. The other pieces on here are more general information that are all really good. It's a little bit regulatory, so I'll try to keep it interesting. The student, other things that you need to have then buttoned up before you go and fly solo, the student pilot certificate. So this is part of FAR 61.3. Let's go and look at that. And one thing I want to mention, sort of a framework to have, it's useful to think of the Part 61 as the regulations around getting your pilot's certificate. So this is all about what it takes to get a pilot certificate, a flight instructor certificate, and all of the rest of that sort of thing. So it's about the actual certificate and being a pilot. Part 91 is all about the operating as a pilot. So 61 is about certification, 91 is about operating. So if you're looking for like minimum visibility requirements, or if you're looking for like, what equipment do I need? All those kinds of things are going to be in part 91 about operations. But if you're looking for, what do I need to have in the plane with me to legally fly? That's going to be a part 61 thing. So let's go to part 61. And I mentioned this in one of the earlier lessons. You know what? This is a good time actually, because I have a note on homework to read the relevant part 91 sections. This is a good time to read the relevant part 61 FARs. Because these are what you're expected to be operating, or this is what you're operating under when you're using your student certificate. Okay, so let's go look at this. And so essentially what this says is, let me get to the full screen one. Okay. So essentially what this says is, in order to serve as required pilot flight crew member, which would be pilot in command also counts for that, you need to have in physical possession or readily accessible when exercising the privileges of pilot certificates. So if you have a student pilot certificate, then that would be that certificate. The pilot certificate authorized, I forgot, this is like a multi-claused piece. Okay, so essentially what this is saying is that in order to serve as required pilot crew member, so this section right here, you need to have, this piece is saying your pilot certificate. And there's a bunch of different forms that may take, like a temporary certificate or a special issuance or that sort of thing. But in general, it means you need to have the actual pilot certificate with you in the plane. So whenever I go out flying, whenever I'm exercising the rights of my certificate, then I need to have that card in the plane with me, or a piece of paper if it's a temporary certificate. That's what all that section says. The next thing it says is you need to have a photo ID that is, and then there's a list of things that it could be, but a driver's license would be the most likely one that you would carry with you. So you need to have your pilot certificate and your driver's license. And the last thing it says on here is you need to have your medical certificate, this block. So the three kind of ones to always remember whenever you go out flying is you need to have your pilot certificate, your government issued photo ID, and your medical certificate. And so if we flip back to the notes here, that's what these three essentially are, is saying that you need to have your student pilot certificate, your government issued ID, and then your medical certificate. FAR 6185 we don't need to go into, but that's essentially how you apply as a student pilot. This medical certificate we can take just another moment on. So this would be either a third class medical is the most likely, and that, depending on your age, will last for either 24 calendar months or 60 calendar months, so 2 years or 2 years or 5 years. One thing I have as a note here is that earlier in these lessons, we should talk about what medical certificates, how long each of them last. This is a classic question to get on your check ride, and actually at the different phase checks as well, because it's an important number to know to make sure you're not beyond your medical date. For most new students, this would be a third class medical that'll allow you to operate as a private pilot. And it lasts for, if you're under 40, 5 years, if 60 calendar months. And if you're over 40, then it's 24 calendar months, so 2 years. This is also one that is good to get early on in your training. So I actually have a homework item in one of the early lessons about getting your medical certificate. If there's a problem getting your medical certificate, you don't want to spend a bunch of money getting your pilot's license before having that sorted out. So just something to be aware of. Okay, so you get all your endorsements together. You're going to be flying with your student pilot certificate, your government issued ID, and your medical certificate every time you go fly solo. A couple things that we should talk about on the student pilot solo requirements. So there's the knowledge test and the pre-solo flight training. Those are the two endorsements up here, so the knowledge test and the pre-solo flight training. On the knowledge test, well, let's look at what the actual language of this regulation is. So if we go to 6187, student pilots. Okay, so okay, great. There's some eligibility things which are good to be aware of, minimum age requirements, things like that. But then the solo requirements are at the bottom here, which you can't see. May not operate solo flight unless the student has met the requirements of this section, essentially saying that in order to fly solo, you need to have qualified under this section here. So let's pull up to the top and look at what that says. First one is the aeronautical knowledge. And specifically, it says that you have to have a test that you have to take a test that demonstrates your knowledge of applicable sections of Part 61 and 91. So we talked about 61 is about certification, 91 is about flight operations. It also needs to include airspace rules and procedures for the airport while solo flight will be performed, and then flight characteristics and operational limits for the make and model of aircraft to be flown. And then for here, it just says that the instructor will administer the test and the instructor will then review incorrect answers. So this isn't necessarily a test that you can fail in the same way, as much as your instructor then has to go through and make sure that you know those things. And remember, at the end of the day, the instructor is endorsing you to be PIC of this aircraft. So they want to know that you've been diligent in your studies, you understand these concepts. And if you went into the pre-solo knowledge test and totally just missed all the questions, that would be a kind of a red flag for a CFI, that the student needs more time. All right, so let's look at a couple of sample questions just to see what those look like. Again, these are not a full knowledge test. A full knowledge test, I think every one I've ever taken is about 2 pages. Most clubs will give them 2 if you want to check out a new aircraft. That's pretty standard sort of procedure. And essentially, it'll pull, well, that's not entirely true. They'll give you the aircraft portion for a new aircraft. The airspace and other things, they assume you know if you have your pilot certificate, because that's part of your check ride. But again, regulations, so that's the part 6191, things like who's responsible for determining aircraft airworthiness. So I'm giving a pause here for a second to think about this answer. Now, I will say that we haven't talked about these in our lesson. So if you went through and read the part, let me make sure I got the right part. Yeah, FAR 91.7. So we haven't talked about this in our lessons, which is why it's in the bonus content. But this is actually the pilot in command. And importantly, the pilot in command is responsible for determining airworthiness, but the owner or operator is responsible for maintaining the aircraft in airworthy condition. So this ends up being a really good sort of checks and balance system. If you've ever been on a commercial flight, or let me say this differently. I was actually on a commercial flight maybe 4 years ago, and the pilot came on the intercom before we took off and said, when I was doing my pre-flight inspection, I noticed something on the door. This sort of like fix had been done. And when I went to go and find what the fix was, it wasn't properly documented. And a missing maintenance entry for something like that is, he didn't say all of this, but I was a student pilot at the time, so I sort of knew the rest of the thought process, which is if it's missing the maintenance entry on that, that means that the aircraft is not airworthy. And the federal aviation regulations say that the pilot in command, this would have been the pilot in command for this commercial flight, is responsible for determining the airworthiness of the aircraft. And so in seeing that there was this bit of maintenance that was done and the documentation wasn't in place, that meant that the aircraft was not airworthy. And although the airline company might have been like, oh yeah, but you should keep going and go fly because we have deadlines and et cetera, the pilot in command is responsible for determining that the aircraft is or isn't airworthy. And if it's not airworthy, you can't fly it. Now, the owner-operator is responsible for maintaining it in an airworthy condition, so the airline company is responsible for making sure it's maintained in an airworthy condition, but at the end of the day, it's the pilot in the command who determines if it is airworthy or not. Okay, so what are the fuel reserves required for VFR day and night flights? We talked about these already, so I'll give a second just to think about the answer there. So for this one, we know VFR day is 30 minutes minimum fuel reserve, night is 45 minimum fuel reserve for VFR. But we also know that it is good practice and something some clubs will actually require that you have minimum fuel reserve beyond that. So my personal minimums are an hour of fuel day or night. I don't want to be going down to the 30-minute day VFR minimum. But that is the legal minimum is 30 minutes VFR day. Alcohol requirements relative to the flight. This is something we talk about with the I'm Safe checklist. So remember, I'm Safe is the pilot pre-flight safety checklist. So is there any kind of illness, I'm Safe illness, medication? Actually, I can pull this up. Illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and then eating/emotion, depending on who you ask. So the alcohol part of this is that you can't have consumed alcohol in the previous 8 hours before you fly, and your blood alcohol level when you fly can't be above 0.04. 0.04 is apparently because there's a certain amount. Actually, let me make sure. Now that I'm saying that, I somehow feel like that's not right. Let me make sure that I got that right, because 0.04 seems higher than I would remember. So 8 hours of consuming, or 0.04 or greater in the blood. So my old flight instructor had asked at one point, he had a doctor he was teaching how to fly, and he asked, is it why isn't it 0 for the minimum alcohol requirement? And the doctor said that there's a certain amount of alcohol that's in your blood just from like normal metabolic processes. And so saying 0 would be kind of an unreasonable expectation for it. And so you want to have something that's not going to cause the pilot to get in trouble just because of their normal body processes. So they have it a little bit higher. At least that was his take on it. I'm reading the chat comment real quick. Ah, okay. So Shoots is saying he saw a YouTube video of a situation where a pedo cover was not removed by the ground crew. The PIC checked the pedo cover removed on the checklist. Okay, so the PIC went through and said the pedo cover was removed on the checklist when he was going through it, but it wasn't. Okay, plane departed and there's no cover and had no AIS information. PIC was at fault, not at the ground crew. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Sort of interesting, especially because they say that the time when, especially in Part 91 operations, like we're talking about the most likely time you're gonna do something silly like that, or the other one is like take off with your tow bar still attached. There was just a story yesterday I was reading about that. You're moving the airplane, you have the tow bar attached, and then something comes up and interrupts your normal pre-flight flow. So there's a lot of folks who will say if you are going through your pre-flight checklist and you have like these different sections. So one section would be like documentation. One section would be the aircraft structure. Another one is like fuel and oil, or however your checklist is broken up. And they'll say if you get interrupted by anyone in the middle of a section, you should go back to the beginning and resume. Because maybe at the point when he got to the pedo tube check, he was just about to go look, and then someone interrupted him. He thought he had already done it, moved on to the next list in the item in the list, and just missed it. He also may have just not checked, which is a whole different problem. But benefit of a doubt, we'll say it was an interruption. So yeah, interesting, good story. Okay, so I'll keep moving through these ones. Again, we're on the regulations section of the sample of a potential questions you might get on a knowledge test. Again, usually it's like 2 pages long, so this is like just a couple of questions to give you a sense of what it would look like. VFR weather minimums at the airport, and what about the airspace of the practice area? So we know that we're flying Palo Alto is a class Delta, and our airspace that we're flying in is a class Echo, but it's within the Mode C veil, and so we have a transponder requirement. And the limitations on the visibility that apply specifically to student pilots. So this is something we haven't talked about yet, but let's actually drop down here and we can look at the student pilot limitations. So FAR 6189. And what this is all about is, as a student pilot, you have certain privileges. As any level of pilot, you have certain privileges and certain limitations. So let's get to the section on 89. Okay, so these are important to know, of course, because you'll have this knowledge of how to fly the aircraft, but there's still certain limitations on how you're allowed to use that certificate. So you may not act as pilot in command of an aircraft that is carrying a passenger, carrying property for compensation or hire, at all, in furtherance of a business on an international flight. This is the one that the questioner is referring to, which is with a flight or surface visibility of less than 3 statute miles during daylight hours or 5 statute miles at night. So although our VFR weather minimums are less than that, your student pilot certificate has a stricter limitation that you can't go less than 3 statute miles visibility. And to be honest, flying in 3 statute miles visibility isn't very much fun anyway. I don't think I would, like if I was going to go practice solo as a student, I wouldn't want to go out in that. Like that's way lower than the amount of visibility I'd want. But it is part of the regulations. You can't do that. When the flight cannot be made with visual reference to the surface. So again, you can't fly over the clouds. A manner contrary to any limitations placed in the pilot's logbook by the authorized instructor. That's this endorsement section that we were looking at, how there's that limitations bit that the instructor can put on. And then the rest of these are for multi-crew aircraft, so you can't fly student when you need another pilot for that type of aircraft. And then there's a different section for sport pilot certificate. So, okay, so the 8 that you see on the screen are sort of the 8 key ones that apply here. There's a little bit more to the regulation below, but it's for situations that probably won't arise here unless you're studying for sport pilot. Okay, so let's flip back to this one. So the answer to limitations on visibility apply specifically to student pilots is 3 statute miles during the day and 5 statute miles visibility at night. You might get, or you will get some airspace questions because it has to be part of the knowledge test. What airspace exists at the surface of the airport? What is the pattern altitude? Where are the practice areas located? What equipment is required to enter this airport's airspace? Can you fly in class Bravo airspace? The answer is no. And what about class Charlie? And the answer here is no, unless you get specific training and an endorsement. Especially around the Bay Area, these two are really important because we have Charlie airspace to our south and Bravo airspace to our north. So there's specific corridors that you're allowed to be in. And then you'll get a couple of questions about the aircraft. Depending on structure, this may be the longest portion. Again, it depends on kind of how simple the aircraft is. I did a lot of my primary training in a Cessna 152, which is like, doesn't get simpler than that. Well, I mean, it does, but it basically doesn't get simpler than that. And so then this section of the knowledge quiz was pretty short. I also did some of my primary training in an Archer 2. Not a pretty straightforward set of systems, but a little more complicated. So this section had a little bit more to it. Questions like what type of fuel does the aircraft use? How many fuel drains are there? Where? Why are there 2 magnetos? What are the various V speeds? This would be like VX, VY, VA, V glide, those sorts of things. What are the procedures for an engine failure? So we talked about this 2 lessons ago. Remember A, B, C, D, E. And what limitations has your instructor put on solo flight? That I guess you could put up at regulations too, but. These, for the most part, you'd look these sorts of things up in the POH. A lot of the aircraft section here is making sure you've read and understood the POH, and also that you know how to look up information if you have certain questions. So they'll probably have a question like, what's the minimum oil that you can fly with, or what's the maximum oil you can fly with? Those sorts of things too. Okay, so that's the pre-solo knowledge test. Like I said, with a real student, this would be the majority of this lesson is you would have done the knowledge test before you came in. We'd review the answers. We'd talk about any ones that you got wrong, and then you'd get signed off for the endorsement on that. The next part is the pre-solo flight training. Of course, we've done most of these ones already, just in that's what the lesson structures have been. But let's look at what these are in case you haven't seen them already. So if I go to the full screen here. So now we're looking at this section C, pre-solo flight training. Prior to conducting a solo flight, student pilot must have, and then it's sort of like received and documented, demonstrated satisfactory proficiency and safety. And then specifically, this list of maneuvers, you must receive training and log that training. And so that's where I had mentioned that in the comments specifically of certain days, there should be certain notes about, today we worked on taxiing and surface operations, including run-ups. Or today we worked on climbs and climbing turns. So this full list probably looks familiar. This is all the things that we've been covering. And that's, one, it's a very reasonable list of things to do pre-solo, so it sort of makes sense anyway. But also that's where the specific choices come from. We don't need to go through this more, but this would be essentially what you're working up towards for that pre-solo. The other piece of it I'll mention is this. So there's the receive and log, but you also have to demonstrate satisfactory proficiency and safety. So one thing that we aren't doing in this simulated version or a sim-based version of the training is you as the student taking the controls and doing all of these things. So although this is the pre-solo knowledge test and review lesson, I wouldn't expect the student is soloing today because we'd still be going out and practicing all of these different things and make sure that you're ready to be PIC in solo flight. All right, so we talked about the student pilot limitations, things like you can't carry passengers, can't fly for hire, minimum visibility requirements. Last one here is logging solo flight time. So you as a student pilot, everything you've been logging would be dual time, and you have no PIC time yet. So you have no pilot in command time yet. At the point of flying solo is the first time you get pilot and command time in your logbook. And so you may log pilot and command time when the student pilot is the sole occupant of the aircraft. So if you have your instructor with you, you don't get to log this. Has a solo flight endorsements required under the Solo Rex, so we looked at that, and is undergoing training for pilot certificate or rating. So if you're no longer working towards your rating, you can't log that PIC time, but assuming you're working towards your rating, you've completed all your solo flight requirements, then you are able to fly PIC solo and to log that time. Which is pretty exciting, actually. I remember the first time I logged PIC time. I mean, everyone remembers their first solo vividly. It's a really cool moment. But I also remember filling it out and it's sort of fun because you have this column of your logbook that you haven't used yet. And then all of a sudden you're like, okay, I get to put in, however much time from that first solo. And then every time you go practice after that, you also get that PIC time. Oops, I didn't switch back, so you didn't see what I was looking at, which is this text right here. So again, sole occupant of the aircraft, and you can't carry passengers anyway. So if you're going to go fly, like that's one of the limitations of a student pilot. So, so this would be like if you weren't the sole, either your instructor's with you or you're flying solo. If you had someone else in the aircraft, you couldn't log PIC time, but also if it wasn't your instructor, that's illegal. So, but when you're the sole occupant, that means that you can log the PIC time, have the endorsements, and you're undergoing training. Logging is something that takes a little bit of practice to get it down. So your instructor will work with you and likely will write the logbook entries for you when you first get going. Over time, they'll help you with that. But if you ever have questions on how to log something, always feel free to ask, especially if you go on for your instrument training. Some of the logging of that is a little weird or can get weird. Yeah, don't hesitate to ask. Okay, so that's the lesson elements here. So we have documentation and paperwork, everyone's favorite. A little bit about the knowledge test, the pre-solo flight training, limitations, and then actually logging that solo flight time. One thing I thought I had on here, and I wonder where it went. Perhaps I forgot, but I will mention, you may want to find out about, oh, I bet I removed it because it's not relevant for the places that I fly. But you may want to find out about the traditions at your local airport or flying club or flight school, wherever you're training with. There's a tradition in some places of cutting your shirt tails. And I should have grabbed a picture actually so you could see. It's basically like, you go and do your solo, and after your solo, then your instructor will kind of cut out a square out of the back of your shirt. And the reason for that is it's this big rite of passage sort of tradition. And it comes from the days when most training was done in aircraft where you'd have one person sitting in front and the instructor in back. But there was no headset situation, so the instructor was always yelling over the aircraft. So to get the student's attention, the instructor would grab the shirt tail of the student and pull on the shirt tail so that they knew to turn around and listen to the instructor. And so the after your solo tradition was that the instructor would cut the shirt tail off because it means that you are now ready to be PIC, you're ready to be pilot in command of the aircraft. You don't need the instructor pulling on your shirt tails anymore. So some schools still do this. Honestly, I haven't seen any in a long time, but every now and then you get one that pops up. And if that's the case, you want to be cognizant. Obviously, you can ask your instructor not to cut your shirt if you like the shirt. But if you want to do that, it's a pretty fun tradition, and you could wear a shirt that you don't mind getting cut out. Other schools will have different approaches. Sometimes they'll do like the, dump a bucket of water like you would do for a sports coach sort of situation. Or the way that my flying club does it is you get a kind of shirt that's dated and signed. And of course you do a bunch of pictures and stuff. So it's sort of a fun thing, but you do want to know what the traditions are of the school that you're working at so that you're not surprised on the day of. The other thing to know about first solo flight, like I said, at this point we've buttoned up all the paperwork, but your instructor won't endorse you for this last solo flight one. until the day that you're going to go solo. So you'll have the endorsement saying that you've completed all the training, but you won't have the endorsement saying that you're allowed to fly solo. And the way that the instructor usually does it is you've got all the paperwork sorted out, you're flying around one day, and at that point, you're doing laps in the pattern and your instructor isn't doing anything. It's a nice weather day and you're flying great. And then they'll usually have you stop and let them out. They'll sign your logbook for that 90-day solo endorsement, and then you get to go off and fly solo. So usually the instructor won't, like, you'll have some idea of when it's going to happen because you've finished all the paperwork, but it's usually a little bit more of like, how is it going on that day of? Some instructors will tell you a little bit more specifically when you're going to solo. I have heard many times that that's a bad idea because it puts a lot of pressure on that particular day, and really the best case is that it's sort of a relaxed day where you're just kind of in the rhythm and you're doing a good job. So, okay, great. So about 47 minutes or so, talked about documentation, talked about all these different things. I mentioned there's a couple of areas that I wanted to cover from things that we, for whatever reason, didn't hit on in earlier lessons. So let's dive into some of these and make sure that we've buttoned up our knowledge of everything for pre-solo. So regulations, operations, and aircraft here. On the regulations side, 91.107, use of seatbelts. So let's go look at 91. Remember, part 91 is all about operations. So this is not about certificate, but this is about what you need to do if you want to fly the aircraft. 91.107. Also, just because I'm highlighting certain ones in here doesn't mean that those are the only ones to be reading about. When you're flying, when you're operating, when you're PIC of the aircraft, you're expected to follow all the FARs. Your ground school course would highlight a lot of the specific ones, but you should also read through all of the laws that you're expected to follow. Okay, so essentially what this says is that this is all about seatbelts in the aircraft. And essentially what it says is that the pilot in command of that aircraft needs to brief everyone on how to fasten and unfasten the safety belt, and if installed, the shoulder harness. So the first part of this is saying everyone in the plane needs to know how the seatbelts work. The second one here is saying that you have to notify everyone to put on their seatbelts before you move, take off, or land. So that's a little more straightforward. There's a bit about children. I want to find the two. Let me make sure I'm not missing something silly here. Oh, that's right. Okay. Yeah. I went through and reread this in detail before today because the summary is pretty straightforward, but let's look at the actual language and then we'll talk about the summary piece. The reason to read the language is that it's a little bit convoluted and you want to make sure that you've kind of processed through specifically what it's saying. So each person on board a U.S. registered aircraft must occupy an approved seat with a seatbelt and, if installed, shoulder harness properly secured about him during movement on the surface, takeoff, and landing. And so essentially what this is saying is that the first part we looked at, you need to know how to, the pilot and commander is responsible for telling you how to use your seatbelt. And then every individual must have their seatbelt and shoulder harness on during taxi, takeoff, and landing. And then there's some bits about like if someone's young enough, they haven't reached their second birthday, then there's slightly different requirements about it. Sorry, I'm looking for the last bit on here, which I know I had. Okay. There's another section that I need to pull out. So I'll say this bit, and I'm sorry that I don't have it immediately in the regulations. Um, this would be a good one that I would mention tomorrow, but of course this is our last live stream for a while. Oh, for anyone who joined late, I mentioned at the beginning. The good news is that I likely got the CFI position, so assuming no hiccups, I'll be starting in the next week. But then the flip side is I don't know what my schedule and life is going to look like in the near future. So because this is a really natural pause point in the live streams, we're going to stop here for now. And then once things settle, I have loved doing these, so I'll see if I can continue just based on how everything in life is going. But this will be the last live stream for at least the foreseeable future. So this would be a great one to follow up on. But anyway, I'll give the summary here. At least that'll be useful. So you have to inform everyone that they have to use or how to use their seatbelts. When your taxi, takeoff, and landing, you have to have the seatbelt on and the shoulder harness on. And then when you're at your crew member station, so if you're the pilot, when you're sitting at your to fly, you have to have your seat belt on at all times. You don't have to have the harness on necessarily, but you have to have the seat belt on. And that goes for all crew members. That's where the regulation that I should have pulled out also is the one that talks about the rest of the crew member responsibility. I'm pretty sure there's a link, but there's like some sort of reference to the specific section within this, but I can't remember where it was. And when I was reading this before, I was looking at the ecfr I think it's .gov, which is the site where I put ecfr.gov, which is usually where I'm reading these. I don't usually read them on the iPad actually, so sorry about that. But essentially, you need to inform everyone how to use their seatbelts. They need to have their seatbelts and shoulder harnesses on during takeoff, if there is a shoulder harness, during takeoff, taxi, takeoff, and landing. And then when you're in the air, when you're in your seat, then you need to have your seatbelt. You as the pilot need to have your seatbelt fastened. It's also a good idea to have everyone in the plane seatbelt fastened in case you hit turbulence. There's just, you never know when it's going to be just a little bump and it could send things flying in the airplane. So there's no reason not to have things secured. Talked a little bit about airworthiness already. So airworthiness, the owner or operator is responsible for maintaining the aircraft in airworthy condition, but the PIC is responsible for determining airworthiness. And let's look at the compliance with ATC FAR. So this is 91.123. And 91.123 essentially says that you have to follow ATC instructions that you're given unless there's an emergency or something like that. So let's look at the specific language here. And so you as a solo PIC, right, you also are expected to follow all of these FARs. So this becomes an important one. When an ATC clearance has been obtained, this is down here, no pilot in command may deviate from that clearance unless an amended clearance is obtained, an emergency exists, or the deviation is in response to a traffic alert or collision system avoidance regulation. So these two, we don't really have that equipment in the size of plane we're talking about. Class A airspace, some information for FARs. This is another big one. Except in an emergency, no person may operate an aircraft contrary to an ATC instruction in an area in which air traffic control is exercised. So a really good example of this would be if you're flying around the traffic pattern of Palo Alto and ATC says Cessna Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra, make one left 360 for spacing. You're expected to say, one left 360 for spacing, Cessna Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra, and then fly that left 360. We'll talk a little bit about phraseology in just a moment and how you might respond to that sort of request, but you are expected to operate, you have to follow ATC instructions when you're within controlled airspace. That's the biggest takeaway for this. There's a little bit of like, if you are given a priority by an ATC in an emergency, then you may have to submit a report, but only if requested by ATC. So we talked about some of that with emergencies. So So that's ATC compliance. If you're talking to ACC, if you're in their airspace, you're expected to follow, not only expected, but you have to follow their instructions. If you are unable to do something for some reason, you can say unable. So one example would be, actually, I had this happen on my commercial check ride, which was sort of like a just one of those things. But essentially, I was coming back. I just finished my commercial check ride. Everything went well. I was passing. Um, the way a check ride works is that the examiner has to tell you at the moment you fail if you failed. So as long as you continue to not have heard you failed, then you're still passing. So I had finished everything. I did all my maneuvers. I'm coming back to Palo Alto, the home airport I was leaving from, and ATC said, enter a. No, they said fly to. Let me make sure I get the waypoint right. I can pull this up on here. So now I have a little bit of a better system for this, but they said fly to this guy, KGO, fly to KGO, and then enter the 45 for right traffic 3-1 from Palo Alto. So essentially what they wanted me to do, I was coming back from, I'll turn this off. Oops. So I was coming back from over here, and what ATC wanted me to do was, instead of coming, normally we would fly just directly in. They wanted me to fly over here and then fly back in. Oops, I'm on the wrong thing here for you to see this. And so, turn these off so you can see. So they wanted me to fly, instead of the normal thing we do, which is sort of fly just north of the Charlie airspace, then enter on the 45, they wanted me to come all the way over here and then come in for traffic spacing. Not a big deal, but I just, it was funny, and the examiner gave me a little bit of flack for it afterwards, but I had never had an instruction that involved KGO. And if I did any flight planning, it was using the Dumbarton Bridge and then over to the mineral plant. So there wasn't really any reason that I would go to this point. Now, there is an expectation that you're familiar with the waypoints in the area. So in that way, I was in the wrong, because I should know the different visual reference points that ATC is going to use. And so I'm on my way back from my commercial check ride, sort of going, oh no, they're asking me to report at a very reasonable visual reporting point, and I don't know it. And so the correct thing to do, and the thing that I did, is if ATC gives you an instruction and you can't follow that instruction for some reason, tell them you can't follow it, and then ask them for either more information or a different thing. So one thing you can say is unable, and then explain why. That's a great kind of catch-all response. Unable, report KGO, unfamiliar, or something like that. In that case, I just said unfamiliar, which is another really useful word you can say back to ATC. So unfamiliar, KGO, and then I think I went conversational, which is, could you give me more specific instruction? Or you could also just say unfamiliar KGO, and they would then respond with what to do with that. And it was, I'm not going to lie, it was a little embarrassing, because I'm like, well, I should know this. And I know I should know this, but if I had gone directly to the airport and I hadn't flown over KGO, if I had just accepted that instruction and then not followed it, not only would that have been illegal, because I'm not following ATC's instructions, but also that would have been a check ride failure, because breaking an FAR on the check ride is a failure. And so, of course, this would have been failing literally as I'm coming into land, which would have been pretty annoying. So anyway, moral of the story is, if ATC gives you an instruction, you have to follow it. If you can't follow it for some reason, you can say unable, you can say unfamiliar, and they'll update that instruction so that it's something you can follow. But you have to follow those instructions. So, okay. So that's regulations. I'll talk a little bit about operations. We haven't talked much about categorical outlooks, and this is something you actually see floating around the aviation community quite a bit. They're pretty nice, actually. So if I go into my aeronautical chart, and I'll turn off some of this stuff so it's not quite so busy. So there's this thing called the flight category or categorical outlook. And it essentially is these, you notice how on my iPad there's all these green dots now. It's like over all the different airports have a green dot. And if I zoom out, I can actually see, turn off some of these pyreps and other pieces so you can see. So now I'm looking at the full picture of the country, and you can see all over the country there is green and blue dots. And so these all translate to different levels of weather at the airport where the category is. So it's the general weather conditions the pilots can expect at the surface. It's not the same as a weather report, but it's just sort of like a, at a glance, what does it look like? So this is useful if you want to get a sense of what the area is like. So for instance, if we look down in Texas and Louisiana, we see all these purple. Well, purple stands for low IFR. And so if we click on that, we can see in the METAR that there's low IFR here. And in that case, ceilings less than 500 feet and or visibility less than 1 mile. And what we're seeing here is that the ceilings, well, the visibility is 0, 0. Oh no, the visibility is 4 statute miles, which is not that one. But the ceilings are overcast at 400. So our ceilings are less than 500, and so low IFR. If we click on the red one, that's IFR, and so we'd expect to see conditions that are, sure enough, our visibility is 5 statute miles, so we're okay from the visibility perspective, but it's lower, it's between 500 and 1,000 feet. We're overcast, and so we get that IFR. Blue is marginal VFR, so this would mean, again, ceilings between 1,000 feet and 3,000 feet, visibility less than 5, greater than 3. And then our last one, green, is for ceiling greater than 3,000, visibility greater than 5, including sky clear. So roughly what it translates to is low IFR means you could maybe do an IFR flight here, but it would be pretty rough conditions, or you'd need specific equipment to be able to do it. Red means it's kind of standard IFR. Marginal VFR means you could fly VFR here, but it might be bad conditions for certain types of flight. And then VFR means that it's generally good, again, visibility and ceilings. It doesn't cover things like wind. It doesn't cover other conditions. For instance, for my interview that I did recently, the conditions around the bay were all green. Everything was VFR flight category, but there was low-level wind shear present that you see in the TAFs, and so that extra information became the important part for the flight. So again, at a glance, it gives you a good sense of what the weather is, but it's not the definitive source. Something you should know about, though, and also if you see any of those maps online where it's like, it shows all the airports for a region, it's got green, blue, red, and pink, magenta, that's what that refers to. Another one that we haven't talked much about, or just in passing, is the POH sections. So POHs, the Pilot's Operating Handbooks, and the AFH, the Airplane Flying Handbook, they follow a specific set of consistent sections, at least after a certain date. It is helpful to memorize those, because when you want to go look in the POH, you'll be able to find the stuff you're looking for faster. Of course, you can use the table of contents if you need to, but just having these memorized is a really useful thing to do early. Section 1 is just general information, limitations in 2, emergency procedures in 3, normal procedures in 4, performance in 5, weight and balance and equipment list in 6, airplane and systems description in 7, handling and service and maintenance in 8, and supplements in 9. Supplements would be like other things installed in your aircraft, maybe certain types of avionics or things like that. So again, nothing you necessarily need to do with these specifically, but it's good to be aware that they are consistent, and memorizing them is a valuable thing to do. The PHAC chapter 9 talks more about these if you want to read through. If you haven't, this is a good chapter, especially if you're in the regulation mindset. And then a note to myself that we do have homework related to reading certain sections of these, but we don't have any homework related to reading the whole POH, which you do want to do at this point in your training. Last one on the operation side is standard phraseology. There's this flight gear link. I can actually post this in the chat. I really liked this. Oop, just seeing the chat question. Let me read this. Full solo flight at some point in the future. Shoots, we could do that potentially. We sort of already have for the context here. When you say full solo flight, what I would think of is like typically a first solo is um, you do 3 takeoffs and landings solo, just laps around the traffic pattern and then come back in and taxi to parking. Is that sort of what you mean, or do you mean like a solo flight, like get the airplane out and go to the practice area and stuff like that? Okay, so while Shoots is responding, here is the ATC phraseology link. This isn't anything official, but it was the best sort of overview that I found, so that's something to check out. The AIM 4-2 has some good information in there. Um, one piece that it mentions is the student pilot identification. So when we've been talking to the tower, we've been saying things like Palo Alto Tower, Cessna Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra, uh, and then whatever our request is, right? So where we are, it's who we're talking to, who we are, where we are, and what we want. What we can say in the who we are part of it is student pilot. So you can say something like Palo Alto Tower, Cessna Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra, student pilot, and then the rest of your request. And essentially, this is something that is officially included in the AIM as acceptable practice, and it's a way of just notifying whoever you're talking to in ATC that you're a student pilot, and essentially to give you some leniency as you figure things out. So I found this to be really comforting when I was doing my solo cross countries. Every time I would go to a new airport, I would include student pilot in my call up. So it would be like, um, Cloquet traffic, Cessna Alpha Lima Tango, or Cessna Tango India Sierra, student pilot, 10 miles to the south east at 3,000 inbound. And so essentially as a way, even outside of talking to ATC, to identify that I'm a student pilot, and any other pilots that are listening, just have the heads up that I'm new to this and may want a little bit more space. I think I put cross country in mine. Got it. Yeah, the solo cross country is sort of actually, you know what we can do? Let me put that real quick as we can finish this lesson with talking about what the rest of um, training sort of looks like. And I can kind of run through that. I will say that the rest of the syllabus, because I pulled some things from earlier and then I moved some things to later, it's a little bit less um, clean looking, but I can walk through essentially what the key components are, and then I'll talk up to what that solo cross country would look like. Okay, so yeah, so that student pilot identification is really nice. Great thing to do while you're a student pilot flying solo. A couple things you may hear on the radar. Roger means I heard you. It is generally you don't need to say Roger for any reason, because if you're just acknowledging that you heard someone, saying your N number is sufficient. So let's say the tower says, um, Cessna Tango India Sierra, we've been advised there are birds on departure leg. And I could say Roger, Cessna Alpha Lima, or Cessna Tango India Sierra. But at that point, I might as well just say Cessna Tango India Sierra, because that is acknowledging that I heard them by saying my N number back. So you sometimes hear Roger. I can't really think of a case where you'd use it. And then if you're reading back more instructions, again, there's no reason to say Roger because you're reading back the instructions. So I always think it's kind of funny because you hear Roger said a lot when people kind of talk about aviation, but yeah. I'm reading this one. Yeah, St. Cloud to Hayward to Cloquet to St. Cloud. Yep. It'd be so long, but folks may find value of VFR. Yeah. So that sort of, how do you choose good landmarks, and how do you do that dead reckoning and pilotage, correcting for wind, that sort of thing, um, are all lessons that build up to doing that sort of first solo you do a first solo cross country, but then you also do a long solo cross country, which is what that route was, the St. Cloud to Hayward to Cloquet. Yeah, shoots. That's definitely something I would be excited to do in the future. Until I figure out what the schedule looks like with my job, I won't be able to commit to it. Um, but yeah, I think that would be a really really fun. I mean, not everything about the cross country I think is really fun, but sort of like how do you decide which landmarks to choose? How do you choose a route? How do you account for weather, other airports that you're going to use maybe for emergencies, and then also picking out waypoints on the ground. Actually, had a really good experience, a little bit of a scary experience, but in a good way. I'll contrast two things. So one thing is when you're flying around the Bay Area, like we've been doing most of our flights here, in and around where we are, there's pretty identifiable things like downtown San Francisco or the ocean, certain mountain peaks that are really 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 easy to distinguish. Out in the Central Valley, it gets a little bit more similar looking, but it's you can actually fly around the bay without really needing to. I mean, you need to pick specific points, but the points are really easy to identify. When I was flying in Wisconsin, though, during this cross country, I was doing my dual cross country, so I was with a flight instructor and kind of going through these things, and I lost track of where I was relative to the many lakes in Wisconsin. And I thought I was over one lake when I was actually over another lake. My instructor knew where we were the whole time, but I sort of was like, oh, okay, we must be here. And then my instructor started asking questions about like, okay, but what are you seeing out your window, and does that match what you would expect to see based on where you think you are? And so it was a good moment of like, oh, you got to be. Essentially, the takeaway was like, you got to be always keeping track of where you are along this flight path. Like you should be watching each lake as it goes by and making sure you know how you're correcting. Is the wind changing your direction, or anything like that? Yeah. Anyway, long way of saying that that is definitely something I'd like to do, but at least for the short term, I can't promise when we'll do it. Okay, so a couple more standard phraseology that you may hear. Wilco is very similar to Roger. It means I heard and will comply. And you'd use that when a readback isn't necessary. When you're first starting out as a student and a private pilot, it's good practice to read back everything because you probably, I mean, you know for sure you need to read back clearances and things like that. But you also want to make sure that you've heard everything and understood it correctly when you say it back to the tower. But Wilco is one thing you can say if you don't need you just want to acknowledge that you will comply with that instruction. Affirmative, negative, so we don't say yes and no, we say affirmative and negative. Contact or no contact means that I have the aircraft in sight or I don't have the aircraft in sight if you say no contact. So if ATC says, traffic on downwind, landing ahead of you, clear to land number 2, you might say contact, clear to land number 2, runway 31. And contact means I have in my sights that aircraft. As soon as you say that you have the aircraft in sights, as soon as you say contact, that also puts the responsibility on you to maintain the separation. Of course, if we're flying outside of the traffic pattern, we all are responsible for that see and avoid principle anyway. But in saying contact and saying you have the traffic in sight, you're saying that you'll also keep it away from it. Say again is a way of saying just please repeat, and you can ask for specific things. Say again altimeter, or say again aircraft location or something like that. Or you could just say again to get the whole thing repeated. Standby, more likely you're going to hear standby from the tower to you, but you can also ask the tower to standby. And standby essentially means I've got too much stuff going on now. I'll talk to you later. You don't need to acknowledge a standby request. So if tower calls you up and says Cessna Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra standby, then that's it. One thing to know with standby, so if you remember to enter a Class Delta airspace, if the controller acknowledges your N number, you've established two-way communication and you can enter the airspace. If they don't say your N number back to you, you haven't established two-way communication and you can't enter the Delta airspace. So this is one of those cases where one of two things would happen when you first call them up. They may say something like calling aircraft standby. And calling aircraft standby also then implies that you can't enter the Delta airspace. So they haven't approved you. They haven't established radio communications because they haven't said your N number, and so you can't enter the Delta. They may instead say something like Cessna Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra, stand by. And that does establish two-way radio communication, and so you could enter their airspace, and you have permission. Essentially, it's their way of saying that you have permission to enter the airspace, but also I'm not going to give you any further instructions yet. And then they would follow up with you shortly after. More likely, if they're too busy to respond to you, they're probably too busy to take you into their airspace, and so they'd more likely say calling aircraft standby. And again, if you are near the Delta and you don't have permission, and they say calling aircraft standby, you got to turn around and not enter their Delta because you don't have permission to be there. And last one I mentioned, unable, and then reason. I cannot do that request because of reason. This is something, I mean, it's best to comply with ATC and to either understand what they're asking for or just to be able to do it. That would be best case scenario. But if you can't for any reason, saying unable and giving them a chance to amend that request is a safe and reasonable thing to do. Unable, unfamiliar, all those sorts of things. Okay, a couple standard phraseology things. Couple aircraft pieces that we talked a little bit about, but let's talk a little bit more specifically. So on refilling the oil of the aircraft, typically at this point, there would have been one day where you've walked out to the aircraft with your instructor and the oil is low. And so you would then go through the process of refilling it. I won't try and do it in the sim because it just doesn't really work. But essentially, the aircraft will probably have some sort of replacement fuel and a funnel, and you can just refill it there. Not a big deal. The more important piece is going to be knowing when to refill. So in the POH, it'll say how low the oil level can get for safe flight and what to fill it up to. So typically a club will have some rule, like for the Cessna, it might be if it gets below 5 quarts of oil on the dipstick, then you're going to put more fuel in. And if you're going long cross country, you should have 8 quarts of fuel or something like that. Again, just picking some example numbers. But you want to know what those are from the POH. Those will also be in the club policies, and those honestly will almost certainly show up in your aircraft checkout or pre-solo knowledge test. Because if you fly with too little oil, your oil might heat up or run out, and then your engine without oil can seize really quickly. So that's walking into a dangerous situation. Next one's sort of in our potpourri of things. I don't think I've ever talked about rolling out of a turn at a half of the bank angle. This is one that we should have talked about when we did 4 fundamentals of flight with turns. So if you're turning to a particular heading, let's say you're turning to a heading of 180, and if you're turning with a 30-degree bank, you want to roll out of that turn with half of the bank. So let's say you're turning from north, you're doing a right turn past, to 180. When you get to a heading of 165, that's 15 degrees off of 180, and so you'd want to start your rollout then. So basically initiate your rollout when you're the number of degrees away from your final heading. That's half of the bank that you're using. This is so that you don't have to snap the plane to level, and it gives you a chance to actually complete a smooth rollout. Throughout the whole rollout process, you're still going to be turning, and so you have to lead that turn a little bit. Otherwise, you'll miss your final angle. All right, these last 3 are all good and a little bit more meaty topics. So each of them gets their own page, and let's dive into these now. So we talked lightly about some of these before, and the place that we talked about these especially was in the four fundamentals. So let's talk about the 4 left turning tendencies. Quotes in here are all from the PHAC Chapter 5. Great chapter to read for this sort of thing. The left turning tendency of an airplane is made up of 4 elements that cause or produce a twisting or rotating motion around at least one of the airplane's 3 axes. So the airplane has this pitch axis, pitching, which occurs along the lateral axis, rolling, which occurs along the longitudinal axis, and yawing, which occurs along the vertical axis. We've seen all of these already. The effect of each of these four elements of torque vary in value with changes in flight situations. In one phase of flight, one of the four left-turning tendencies may be more prominent than another. In another phase of flight, another element may be more prominent. So we're going to talk about each of the four left-turning tendencies, and we're going to talk about where you're most likely to encounter it during flight. The highest level takeaway from this, though, is for whatever phase of flight you're in, the ball should be centered in the turn coordinator. So step on the ball is the phrase that we've used quite a bit. You often need right rudder during takeoff and climb to counteract the left turning tendencies. That's why it's called the left turning tendency, is because it's usually to the left. But it's essentially, the answer is always keep the ball centered, use as much rudder as required. All right, so the four tendencies are, and the expectation is not that you memorize these. The expectation is that you know that certain phases of flight are going to require more right rudder than others. And you should be preparing for that, understanding where it occurs, and then using the rudder appropriately when you need it. Okay, so the four tendencies, let me do it like this, is torque reaction, spiral slipstream, p-factor or asymmetric loading, and then gyroscopic precession. Torque reaction is essentially the equal and opposite reactions, Newton's third law, saying that as the aircraft's propeller spins one direction, the aircraft's body wants to spin the other direction. So we have this sort of torque reaction that goes on here. So rotating of the propeller clockwise from the pilot's perspective causes the airplane to rotate the opposite direction. That's a rotation along the longitudinal axis. This is a rolling action. In the impact during cruise flight, pretty much the aircraft is designed during cruise flight for this not to be an issue, so you don't have to do much for it. However, during the takeoff roll, you can feel this as a left turn. So the clockwise propeller forces the left tire harder onto the ground, causes more friction, and causes the nose to turn to the left. Again, left turning tendency. So to counteract that, we use right rudder as necessary. It's like an open mitigation. Right rudder as necessary to align with the center line during takeoff roll. So the reason this is important to know is when you're sitting at the end of the taxiway, not very much RPM on the propeller, so it's not spinning that fast, and then you bring power in, you can expect that you're going to get this left turning tendency. You're going to need right rudder to keep the nose aligned with the center line. Second one here is a spiral slipstream. So this has to do with the fact that when the propeller rotates, it creates this corkscrewing motion that actually hits the vertical stabilizer and causes the aircraft both to move, to yaw to the left, but also then to roll to the right. And that yaw to the left sort of thing, sort of motion, that left turning tendency again, is primarily what you're seeing. So the impact here is the spiral slipstream strikes the right side of the vertical fin, especially at low speeds, and yaws the nose left. At faster speeds, the stream elongates and it's not as impactful. So really, this is a big thing during slow flight. Unsurprisingly, the mitigation is use right rudder, again, step on the ball to keep the airplane coordinated. Third one here is p-factor or asymmetric loading. We talked a little bit about this in one lesson during climbs. I think we talked about it. This one is a little trickier to visualize. This is a great one to go out to the plane with your instructor and actually just look at the plane in different flying attitudes. But essentially what happens is that when you're flying straight and level, the angle of attack of that propeller is equal regardless of if the plane is the propeller is moving upward or moving downward, and so you get equal thrust generated here. However, when the plane is climbing, when it's moving upwards through that air mass, the downward moving propeller has a higher angle of attack than the upward moving propeller. And since the let's do it like this actually. Let's go to the sim. We have it here, and this is a great one to just do. I really wish I could rotate the propeller just slightly more. Okay, so how's that work? Great. All right, 1 second while I get the drone speed down. Okay. Oops, I don't want to do that just yet. So if we look at this propeller, and apologies that I can't get quite the angle I want. When I did this, the last live stream, I tried a bunch of starting and turning off the engine and just couldn't get it quite to work. Oops, not like that. What am I doing wrong here? There we go. So we have this propeller, and when we're moving and the aircraft is level, the propeller has this angle that it's striking the wing. And so just like a wing, the propeller has a little bit thicker portion over the top here. It forms just like the wing does. And that, oops, let me see if I can get it like that. And that angle that it's taking and the curve of the propeller is what then causes the forward, the generation of thrust, right? And so again, when we're in level flight, then the wing here, and I'm going to move to just the flight sim so I can get these angles better. When we're in level flight, the propeller is taking a bite on this end. That's equal, the angle of attack, the flow over it, to the propeller bite for this propeller, right? So you can see that it has that kind of curve and it goes right down. However, if we tip the aircraft back, so let's say that we were in climb. So how I'm going to do this is I'm actually going to put a bunch of weight in the cargo area. Tip that aircraft back. There we go. The owner would not be happy about that. We have one propeller that's rising, that's this one, and one propeller that's descending. So if you look at this angle of the propeller here, the rising propeller essentially is flat with respect to the wind, right? And so it's generating very little thrust forward when it's rising through the air. But the propeller that's descending has this really big angle to the wind. This is where I wish I get the two to be actually level, but at least you can see what I'm talking about. So this huge angle to the angle of attack relative to the wind then means that on the right side, it's generating a lot more thrust. So because the rising one generates more thrust than the descending one, that means that when we're flying, we get a yawing moment to the left. So the propeller on the right side generates more thrust during a climb, causing us to yaw left. So, of course, the impact then here is when you're at a high angle of attack during a climb or during slow flight, then you're going to have this more thrust on the left side, which means that the right side, which means you're going to have a left turning tendency. Mitigation, surprise, surprise, is use right rudder to keep the airplane coordinated. So step on the ball to make sure that you're still flying straight. Last one on here is gyroscopic precession. This one is the most complicated and also applies the least to a tricycle gear airplane. If we were in a tailwheel aircraft, this is a more critical piece. You do see it in the kind of aircraft we're flying, but just less pronounced. So gyroscope, when it's rotating, if you apply, so like let's say that you have a gyroscope rotating, or in this case, it's actually the propeller, and you apply a force here, the force is being effectively applied here, but it's going to be felt 90 degrees further. So in particular, when the propeller's spinning, it makes a great gyroscope. And so if you roll the aircraft into a takeoff position, as you pull back to roll it into the takeoff, that applies a force essentially the same as what you're seeing here. So it applies a force here, which means that you're going to have a resulting force 90 degrees down, which is going to cause the nose to yaw actually to the right. But we move through such a small angle to get to take off when we're in a tricycle gear plane that it's just not that pronounced. The more common one where you see this is in a tailwheel aircraft, because for a tailwheel aircraft, we start with the wheel on the ground, but as we gain speed, we roll forward. And so in that case, we're lifting the tail up. That applies a force this way and causes the nose to yaw left. So if this isn't already confusing enough, The short version is for our kind of plane, it's just not that big a deal. And the, the solution for it is right rudder as needed. I'm sorry, is rudder as needed to keep aligned with the center line. So, it kind of works the same. Or if you go into a climb or descent, you'll also get some yawing, or you'll get some yawing. So that's something to know about. Is it does happen in flight too. But if you are flying a tailwheel aircraft at any point, when you roll into it, that yaw to the left is something you should anticipate and be ready to correct with right rudder, because you're going to have the tail rolling forward, whereas in this aircraft, when we take off, we lift the nose back. Okay, I hope that wasn't terribly confusing. These 4 are all things that get quizzed pretty heavily for commercial check ride. They are things that a private pilot should be aware of, but mostly you should know that you want to stay coordinated using right rudder, and you should know when you're anticipating needing that right rudder. So slow speeds, when you're climbing, when you're slow speeds when you're climbing, and then also when you are taking off down the runway to stay aligned with center line. Another one, of course, is adverse yaw. That's not one of the left turning tendencies, but that is something we use rudder consistently for coordinated turns. Okay, for left turning tendencies, we have another aerodynamics one, which is static versus dynamic stability and how trainer planes are designed. So we've talked a little bit about this, especially when we talk about trim, but stability is how an aircraft corrects or doesn't correct from disturbances. And so a disturbance may be control input, such as pushing the yoke forward, or like a gust of wind or things like that. 2 key types of stability. Again, things that as a private pilot you should be aware of, but mostly you just need to know how the aircraft behaves. This is more like commercial pilot or CFI type stuff to be memorizing. Static stability essentially means what is the response given a disturbance. So a positive static stability would be if you apply a force, this is going to just come back. Neutral static stability means it's going to stay where it goes, and negative static stability means it's going to fall all the way over. Another example here, all from the PHAC. Dynamic stability is the response over time. So this is how oscillations develop. We want an aircraft that has positive static stability, so if it starts to oscillate, it dampens. But you could have designs where it'll actually oscillate stronger and stronger, and then eventually get out of control. These are important because you should be aware the aircraft, especially the trainer aircrafts we're flying in, are designed to have good stability characteristics when they're loaded within the flight envelope. So as long as you keep your weight within that envelope that we talked about, then you'll get these nice characteristics. If you load them outside the envelope, that's where you start to get potentially bad interactions. We talked about all of these already. We don't really need to go much around more into it. There's a couple ways that we get that lateral stability. The biggest one that you see is dihedral. And so let's go back into the sim here. Oops. Okay, so there's 2 things that I'll point out in the sim. So one of them is this dihedral shape. So you notice that the wings that we're seeing actually curve up slightly. And so that dihedral shape then causes the aircraft to correct for disturbances. So the aircraft tends to come back to a wings level position, assuming that it's not so far into a turn that it would be then an overbanking tendency. But in general, if you're on level flight, the aircraft will come back to a roughly level position. Another thing about this is the keel effect. And so because the weight in this aircraft is below the wings, just like a pendulum, it kind of also comes back to level. So we don't need as big a dihedral in this plane. In like the Piper Cherokee, though, you see a really actually pretty pronounced dihedral. Looks more like this. So like there's another example of dihedral here. And so you can see that kind of bigger. You also see them in big commercial planes. They have that up. So that's all about lateral stability. The next one, longitudinal stability, is all about coming back to level flight with a disturbance along a pitching moment. So if you push forward on the elevator, the aircraft should come back to level flight. We've looked at this before where the CG is in front of the center of gravity is in front of the center of lift, and there's a certain amount of downforce from the horizontal stabilizer. That downforce then keeps these all in balance, but it also means that if you increase lift by pulling back an elevator, or if you decrease lift pushing forward on the elevator, that those forces will become unbalanced, and over time they'll naturally rebalance themselves. And then there's directional or yawing stabilities. This is yawing of the nose. And so just like an arrow, we have this vertical stabilizer, and that if there was airflow passing along that side would kind of push the nose back to straight. So just like an arrow, the airplane wants to fly straight. Okay, so let's go and look at what that looks like actually in the aircraft. And I need to fix my weight here. So if I pull this back up, get our lights on, do the old Control E start, I think that'll be okay. And what I want to show is just if we get up to sort of a nice even cruise, and then give a control input, that the aircraft will come and naturally come back to where it was flying before. This is one of, in my opinion, I think one of the coolest things about aircraft design is this lateral, or is this stability consideration. Something I often lament when driving, having this after getting my my pilot's license, was the fact that you can't just like let go of a car and it'll just drive itself on the highway for you. So whereas the aircraft actually is designed so that it's generally, even if it gets bounced around, which actually the weather conditions of today are kind of bouncing us around, and the aircraft wants to come back to neutral. So we're at 1,900. We got a little bit. So I'm not touching the controls at all here. I've trimmed it up using this trim tab, and then the aircraft will continue to bring itself back to roughly neutral. I'm going to remove the weather just so that we don't have. This is actually a good example of where that comes into play, but I'd rather show it in a smooth weather day. Okay, so let's look at each of these different types of stability. Excuse me. So first things first, let's get to a level flight. Okay, so we're flying level. We have a little bit of right rudder we need, so I'm going to put just a little bit of right rudder in. Otherwise, I think we're good. And if I then push forward on the yoke, so you'll see the yoke move forward, and watch what the airplane does. So you see how it had a pitching down moment, and then it gains airspeed because now it's going down. As it gains airspeed, then it's gaining more lift. As it gains more lift, it starts to climb back up, and so eventually it'll oscillate back to normal. That sort of oscillation may take a little bit of time to stabilize, but over time it will. Next one I'll show, let's see if we can get a better view from the front here. If I deflect the ailerons, the plane will eventually come back to wings level. I love that it's seeming to just hold it, which is not implausible, but is not what it's designed to do. So it should come back to wings level on its own. Whether or not that's actually how the Cessna would behave versus not, I'm not totally sure. My experience is that Cessna tends to be pretty stable here, and that if you deflected it, it would actually come back. But that's the idea, at least. So with a strong dihedral, if you deflect off to the side, maybe I'll do a little bit more here, then eventually it's going to bring itself back to wings level. And then the last one, of course, is the yawing moment. So if I throw in rudder like this, now we're generating a lot of wind off to the side. As soon as I let go of that rudder, the airplane straightens itself right back out. So that's that stability design. Okay. Good little sidebar on those. Hop back to the lesson plan. The last thing we'll talk about today is leaning the mixture. We talked a little bit about this in our flight to San Martin. We did a little kind of short cross country. leaning the mixture is something we do anytime we're operating above us. For leaning the mixture for this aircraft is anything we do when we're operating above 3,000 feet in cruise flight. There's a little bit more to that sentence, and it also depends on the POH, but for this aircraft, that's sort of the general rules. Above 3,000 feet, you want to be leaning the mixture when you're in cruise flight. If you're in a climb, you also want to be leaning as you climb because the engine won't be performing as well. So let's talk a little bit about all of this. So fuel mixture must be leaned to produce optimal engine performance and to prevent the spark plug fouling from lead deposits. A little bit of information. Everything from here comes from what in researching this, I found this resource, this engine operation for pilots, which is probably the best summary I've ever read on this information. So I ended up grabbing large portions of it because it's like just the best collection. So let's talk a little bit about what it is. A couple reasons why we lean: improved engine efficiency, greater fuel economy, so we're not burning as much fuel just to be flying around. Smoother engine operation, saves engine accessories and engine mounts. Longer spark plug life, less fouling. This is the one you hear most often quoted. But the smoother engine operation is also, this is really acute and you see it during your run-up test, whereas this is like kind of long-term engine health. Reduced maintenance costs, reduced operating costs, and then more desirable engine temperatures while operating at cruise altitudes. So I'm realizing I had a section on here on, oh no, it's right here. Okay, good. So let's talk a little bit about what leaning is. Engines burn fuel best at a particular ratio of volume of fuel to volume of air. So the engine is designed to combust with that precise mixture of, oh, I'm sorry, this is not volume, this is weight. And so at high altitudes, though, we have less dense air. And so the mixture control allows us to reduce the weight of fuel to keep that proper ratio. So at higher altitudes, less dense air. Less dense air means that we're burning fuel, or it means that we need to reduce the amount of fuel that's being used by the engine to make sure that we're keeping that ratio correct. This is true for normally aspirated engines. So this is an engine that uses just the air in the atmosphere around the aircraft for combustion. If you had like a turbocharger or something like that, that would provide more dense air going into the cylinders. That would be something that would let you fly at a higher altitude with more rich fuel. But for what we're flying in the Cessna 172, that normally aspirated engine, we're using the mixture control to make sure that we're keeping the proper ratio. Okay, so why we lean, we talked about these: improved engine efficiency, better fuel economy, lots of other reasons. So when to lean, your POH is the official source for this answer, although generally you lean a normally aspirated engine whenever the engine is developing less than 75% power, and above 5,000 feet MSL, you can't develop more than 75% power. So that's why they say usually above 5,000 feet MSL. Many trainers recommend leaning in cruise above 3,000 feet MSL. That's also what we recommend for the 172 here. And you want to enrich in the mixture when you enter the pattern. So you know the GUMPS check: gas, undercarriage, mixture, propellers, seatbelts, and switches. So that mixture is about enriching the mixture. And we're doing this to prepare for a go around. So if you think of it this way, we want to have rich fuel whenever we're developing more than 75% power. When we're coming into the pattern, although we're using less than 75% power in the pattern, we're preparing for that go around where we're going to need to use full engine power. And so we want to have the mixture rich. If you get into flying at high altitude airports, there's a couple of different procedures we use at those higher altitudes. We won't go into those now, but if you're considering flying them in the mountains or high altitude, you should do a mountain checkout with a CFI. It's a great way to learn about some of the considerations for flying higher. Okay, so how do we actually lean? Again, this is from the engine operation for pilots. There's the tachometer method, which is especially what you learn in an aircraft that doesn't have quite so many fancy tools as the aircraft the 172 SP that we're flying in. So for instance, when I was flying the Cessna 152, this is essentially the method that we would use. And so what you're doing is you're getting everything set up for the cruise power setting that you want. So the first thing you do is get to the right speed, the right like configuration, RPM, everything basically set up for what you're going to use for cruise flight. And then you slowly twist the mixture knob back until the tachometer reading peaks. So you're looking for the tachometer to be generating. So you should get the most RPM you get when that mixture, as you lean the mixture, you're going to get an increase in tachometer and it'll have some peak. At peak RPM, the engine is operating with maximum power range. So maximum power means you're generating the most power for the engine, but for a lot of our cruising, we want the best economy operation. So we're going to use less fuel per hour of flying and we'll be able to fly farther. And to do that, then we continue leaning all the way to that maximum power peak and then continue leaning beyond that until the engine starts to run roughly. What you usually notice right away, one, you might notice the engine depending on how it's set up, but you will notice the tachometer, our engine RPM, will drop. And so you're leaning, and then the tachometer drops, and then at that point, then you enrich in the mixture until you get smooth operation again, and then continue to enrich in a little bit beyond that. And that gives you a pretty rough way of leaning the engine, but it's an acceptable way, especially in an aircraft that doesn't have any other instruments. Okay, so let's try that out in this aircraft. So if we go in here, and this isn't a great example because, what I'll do is like that, so you can see the procedure still. So this isn't a great example in that we are in, well, actually, let's get to level flight here. I'll bring the power to maybe 24. Okay. And I'm going to bring this aircraft up a little bit higher so that we're at a more reasonable leaning altitude, maybe 4,500. One thing I'll point out, because we've run into this already once with the sim, is the engine's indications don't necessarily match what you would see in a real aircraft. So I'll explain the procedure, but I'm not sure that we're actually going to see what we're expecting to see. So, okay, so we can say, let's say we're set up for cruise here. We're at 2,400 RPM. We should be level flight, so we shouldn't have any of this going on, but it should be okay because we're in a pause break on the sim, so it's just sort of running everything without actually moving. And what I want to do actually is go look at the engine instruments. Okay, great. Okay, so there's our RPM, and you have our RPM and our mixture together here. And so what I'm expecting to see is that as I slowly, and you twist along this thing, so a flight instructor showed you how to do that, but I'm expecting to see as I bring this back that the RPM will eventually increase to peak, and that's the max power. Okay, so we actually do see it going up a little bit. That's pretty cool. So there's our RPM is increasing. Okay, and now it's coming back down again. So our max power is right there. So you notice that our RPM has actually gone just above that line when we started just below that line. So there's peak power if we wanted to lean for peak power. Typically we leaned at peak RPM, for maximum economy, best economy, excuse me. And so if I continue leaning this, then we're going to eventually reach a point where we have a significant drop in RPM. And we'll see how that works in the sim. Okay, we lost a little bit there, and so normally I'd expect it to fall off a little bit more, but we'll say that that's okay. So we'd see something like this. We say, okay, now we're on the other side of that performance curve. So now we want to enrich in it a little bit further to bring it back to more or less the performance we were getting before, but then on the lean side of that max power. So leaned for best economy. All right, I hope that was sort of helpful. So that's the tachometer method. The engine rough method, I haven't ever heard of this described this way, and they say it's for float type carburetors only. This is a fuel injected engine, so I don't suspect we'd see anything anyway. But it reads essentially the same as like you, instead of using the tachometer, you're leaning until the engine runs rough, and then you bring in the power again, and that gives you your best economy. So fuel flow indicator method. So in this aircraft, we do have a fuel flow indicator. That's this guy. And we know that in our POH, we have oops, let me turn so you can see it. This guy here. And we know in our POH what the fuel flow should be for certain cruise and power configurations. So we're at 2000, or this is 4,400, and we're at 2400. So if we went into our POH under our performance section, we can actually look up what the fuel flow should be. So let's go and just take a look at this real quick. So here is and essentially what this is saying is like, if you lean to the correct fuel flow, that is the correct mixture that you should be using for that altitude. So, okay, so let's do this all through. Let me go to the flight sim and iPad so you can kind of see. So you may remember we talked about this in a past lesson. So if we are at, let's find out what our pressure altitude is. So the first thing we do for our pressure altitude is we set our altimeter to 29.92. So in this case, we're already set there. If it had been like a high altitude day, maybe we were set like this at a high pressure day, maybe we were set like this at the airport. So the first thing we do is dial this back to 29.92. That gives us our pressure altitude. And then we take that pressure altitude and look up what our cruise performance would be there. So 4,000. We're a little above 4,000, so we would interpolate between these two to find the exact number we're looking for. Next thing we do is actually, let's go to 4,000 specifically to kind of simplify this math. So if we drop down here, so now we're at 4,000. Keep it simple. Okay, there we go. So now we're at 4,000. There's a couple other things we need to look at though. We know that our pressure altitude is 4,000 because we set our altimeter to 29.92. We need to get our outside temperature. So if we click on this, it'll give us our outside air temperature of 7 degrees Celsius. Our standard temperature at the surface at sea level is 15 degrees Celsius. And then we lose 2 degrees Celsius for every 1,000 feet we go up. So we're at 4,000 feet, means we should be down 8 degrees Celsius. 15 minus 8 is 7 degrees Celsius. So again, the beauty of the flight sim is we have a perfect standard conditions day, which doesn't usually happen. But that means that we can look at our standard temperature here. Let's say that it was 20 degrees warmer than that. Maybe we'd be here, or maybe we'd have to interpolate between the two. Just sort of depends on what the weather is outside. But today at this altitude, we have our standard temperature. And we have our RPM setting is 2,400. Okay. And so our fuel flow we're expecting to get is 8.5. So part of what that would be is when we're doing our fuel planning, we would have selected our power setting we want to use and everything else about it. And we would have planned around that fuel. So now when we're leaning, we're going to actually get that fuel performance. So what we would do is bring the mixture back. You can't see it, but I'm slowly bringing the mixture back. And we would keep leaning until we get to 8.5. Okay, so that would be the correct leaning then for the power setting that we have. Now, if we go look at our tachometer, we've lost quite a bit of our engine power in doing that. So again, I don't believe that the fuel flow in the aircraft works exactly how it's supposed to for the sim. So I'm not going to read into it too much, but it would be that if you set your fuel flow correctly, then that is your correct leaning. So I wouldn't expect quite this interaction, but yeah, although I guess it's possible, but anyway. So yeah, so now at 24 RPM, I'm kind of bringing the power up again, leaning this again. Yeah, anyway. Okay, so but that's the idea, is that you know what the fuel flow you should have is, and so you just set the fuel flow on here for the power you're using, and bam, you're leaned. The last method on here is exhaust gas temperature method. So this is the one that you most commonly see in the POHs. And essentially what this is saying is that, and this is also the one that we did on the flight to San Martin we did, which was very, very clearly we weren't getting the same results. So we know that if we're leaning to the fuel flow, it should be the correct leaning. We also know if we're leaning to the exhaust gas temperature, it should be the correct leaning. And what you'll see in about 2 seconds is they don't line up at all. but we can at least look at what it is. So operation at peak EGT is the minimum fuel consumption and also the maximum power. But we typically lean it to be 50 degrees rich, so 50 degrees on the EGT rich of what the peak EGT is. So we don't typically operate at peak EGT. We want to have the engine running a little cooler than that. And so let's go back to the sim. So if you go on the Cessna POH, this is also the method that they talk about, is that 50 degrees rich of peak. Okay, so let me do all of these again. So we're at 24. I'm going to bring the mixture full rich, bring our power back to 24 here. Good. Okay, and now I'm bringing the mixture back, and I'm going to slowly bring it back to watch where the EGT peaks. So the EGT is the left side of the fuel flow. Still bringing it back. Still bringing it back. Okay, it's starting to rise there. Starting to rise. Continue to bring it back. And okay, now it's peaked. So it's starting to come down now if I go any further. So I'm going to go bring this EGT reference up to where it peaked, which was here. And then I want to enrich in the mixture. So now I'm bringing the mixture back in. The red one, I'm going to start bringing it in. I can't show you both at the same time. Until I am 50 degrees rich of that. So bringing the mixture in. Now we're back at the peak where we found it before. Continuing to enrich in. Continuing to enrich. Okay, this is kind of ridiculous. So this is what I meant by like the sim just doesn't do it justice. So I'm now full rich. What we would have seen is we would have seen this EGT go down to here. And it would have gone down to there right about when the fuel flow is correct. So we'll kind of chalk it up to the sim being incorrect. But that way of leaning it and this way of leaning it should give us about the same results. Okay, so that's leaning the mixture. Again, we lean the mixture to keep the ratio of fuel to air correct, so that the engine performs either at best economy or at best power, depending on what we need for that flight. Last thing here, we have about a minute left. We'll quickly run through what the rest of the syllabus looks like just to have a reference for anyone who's curious. And then we'll close out for today. So completion standards today, client has completed pre-solo knowledge test and received all necessary endorsements besides the solo endorsement, which will come on the day you actually fly. Required homework, read the relevant parts of relevant Part 91 FARs. And then recommended homework, you want to review past lessons and then review the pre-solo ground school content. So whatever ground school you're using for your overview or your ground school education, they'll probably have a pre-solo section to it, and it's good to go through and re-review all of that. All right, so let me pull up this is the overview of this syllabus that I have. So these are the lessons that we've already done. The stage 2 here is about navigation and cross-country flight, and stage 3 is night flying and check ride preparation. So among these things, steep turns, short field and soft field takeoffs and landings. So steep turns is all about overbanking tendency and what it means to have that much of your lift directed into the vertical plane. Short and soft field takeoff and landings are for either short runways that you're working with, or if you have obstacles at the end or the approach end or the departure end of the runway. Navigation systems, we start to get into how to use VORs and GPS and look at more of like the GNS 530 sort of stuff. Aircraft performance, including weight and balance. This is starting to develop the ability to figure out how to load the aircraft, figure out weight and balance problems, plan for fuel. Weather information and cross-country flight planning. So now we're looking at weather information over a region and also how that affects our cross-country flight plans. Pilot and dead reckoning, pilotage and dead reckoning. Pilotage is identifying things on the ground and kind of flying towards them. Kind of a fancy word for that. Dead reckoning then is knowing which way the wind is blowing and how that impacts your heading, flying certain compass headings and expecting to show up at certain places at specific times. These are all the key things that you do. Pilotage and dead reckoning would also be the flight where we start to do dual cross-country flights. really we would be doing that this whole time, but that's where we would say, okay, let's go through and plan everything that we're going to need. We'll fill out a full nav log. We'll have wind correction angles. We'll do all of that sort of navigational aspects. Lost procedures, diversions to alternates. So this is if the weather's bad, you got to go somewhere else, or if you get lost, what to do. And then emergency flight reference to instruments, for fundamentals, and recovery from unusual flight attitudes. So these are, again, both about if you inadvertently fly into a cloud, what to do about it. Really meant as emergency just in case, but it's a good practice to be working on. And then the last piece here is night operations and night cross country. So one of your flights will be a dual night cross country, as well as we'll do a bunch of night takeoffs and landings. Emergency operations, I moved this to much earlier, but originally the syllabus had some emergency operations towards the end. And then lesson plans, review and check ride preparation. Oh, this is the full path, but it's review and check ride preparation. The last thing being then the private pilot quiz and private pilot solo phase check, and then you go to the federal examiner for your final check ride. All right. Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Any last minute questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. Otherwise, I will keep the Discord posted, and also you'll see in Twitch if I have anything coming up, I'll put it in there as well. It's been really great doing these private pilot, the pre-solo lessons with you all. So thanks everyone for joining. Really had a blast, and I'll be keeping an eye out for ways to resume them in the future. Oh, thanks, Shoots. Yeah, I think it was really good. Yeah, at some point maybe later on I have a blog that I keep as well. I feel like sort of some of the thought processes I was using for my next steps in CFI career. Well, I can talk briefly about it here, which is realizing that the lesson plan order is imperfect in that there are cyclical dependencies of knowledge. So there are certain things that would be great to teach first, but then as you start to follow that back, you end up in these weird circles. And so part of the reason I decided going to work at a flight school would be a really good idea is to learn more about how they think about breaking some of those cyclical dependencies and making it easier for students to learn. Just sort of like I was realizing I was reinventing the wheel as I was going through. So yeah, so it was really good. And also, I mean, I love teaching. I love getting a chance to use Microsoft Flight Sim to do this sort of thing. So I would say wins across the board. All right, great. Well, everyone have a great rest of your Monday, and I will hopefully see you in the future.